Yes, Philip, if you want. Wait,
This is
wait,
just
wait, I'm not sure whether you're in focus yet. Wait.
Oh yes, this is a big amount of publicity for the statement I'm going to make. It's just...
Right, yes. right, Philip.
I thought that was a great talk, but I just wanted to say a tangent about Gideon Algernon Mantell, because it hasn't been mentioned recently. He is buried in the West Norwood Cemetery, and you can see his tomb there.
The thing I wanted to say about that is that I actually tried to establish what the link was between Gideon Mantell and the Humes. And he is older than Hume, so they didn't go to school together. But Gideon Mantell is in correspondence with Joseph Hume. And they do meet on several occasions, so I suspect family friend. And Gideon Mantell came from a liberal background, very similar to the whole Joseph Hume story. Like, we haven't even really talked about Joseph Hume today, because there are obviously people in the audience that don't know. But his father was a huge influence on everything that he did. So.
And maybe not everybody here knows that Mantell was the man who really discovered, or his wife actually, the bones that gave rise to dinosaur understanding.
Yeah,
That
iguanodon.
Yeah, well, that was what he called it.
Yeah. I'm sure it's called something else now.
Rose, do you have a question or comment?
Just that I think it was a good decision to make the old man a curator for life, because it kept his daughters in bread and butter, and they did the work.
Right.
They also paid, yes.
I think in the correspondence it does say that one of the daughters was feeble-minded, so she was not. I was going to take bread and butter.
Yes, and one of them had to be institutionalised as well.
Wasn't much good.
Yeah.
Right, Rizwan.
I was interested to know if there was something Hume stated explicitly why he created it, or what his hope for the SLBI was.
I think if you look at Hume's background, and then if you look at the time period, Hume is a Victorian, and they, knowledge was progress, and society changed significantly in the Victorian period. You suddenly had this new emergence of a working class that had free time. They had more money than they'd ever had before, and they were starting to have marginally fewer children. So even if they only had one or two fewer children than before, they actually had a little bit more money, and so they had free time. And at that time, gambling and betting and football, apparently, were great pastimes of the Victorian people. And a huge number of people became urbanized. I mean, if you study history at school, you would have all known this, but I obviously didn't study history in England, so I didn't know any of this. But a huge movement, a huge amount of urbanization, and a significant proportion of the population was living in cities at that time. And the cities were characterized by squalor and filth, and people with a little bit more money spending it not very in dubious ways. So I think it's likely that he came here and he possibly wanted to lift people up. But if you actually look at the membership in the early days, it looks like they look pretty well educated to me. They don't look like people right off the street. And there was also some of the early members are slightly, I know Henry Groves thought that it was a great vision, but he didn't think it was particularly practical. Does that answer your question?
Could I ask Robert a question now? Hume offered his birds to the Natural History Museum in London. Did he ever envisage, say, presenting them somehow to the potential Indian institution?
Yes, he did in 1867, when he left Ottawa. He wrote a letter to the governor of the Northwest Provinces, saying that because he had assembled this, at the time, substantial collection of 2,500 specimens, he was now moving from Ottawa to a different job, it would be difficult for him to hold on to this collection. He would like it to be the nucleus of a museum probably based in Agra. And there was considerable discussion of this, and it was in principle agreed to. But nothing seems to have happened, and I suspect that Hume found that maybe the officials did not in fact follow through on it. On the other hand, maybe Hume found that in his new post he had the funding, etc., to keep the collection. But he certainly at that time thought of handing that collection, relatively small, over. By the time he came to giving up ornithology, the scope of his collection was such that there was no institution in India which he would have felt confident in. There were one or two major museums, notably in Calcutta, but talking about Blyth, he had already been damning about how the management there had both supervised Blyth and in fact run the museum. The reason he offered the collection to the Natural History Museum was largely because of Sharp being in the museum, because he had an enormous admiration for what Sharp was doing, and at the time Sharp was engaged in producing the 27-volume Catalogue of Birds in the British Museum, which is probably the single most important work in systematic ornithology ever produced and still referred to now. And by passing his collections to Sharp in the Natural History Museum, all the information concerning them could go towards that work, and it would get the message out.
Thank you.
Had Sharp Indian connections?
Sorry?
Had Sharp Indian connections?
Sharp personally didn't have Indian connections. The Natural History Museum already had moderate Indian collections because, of course, India had for long been part of the British area of influence, and individuals had been sending material back to the Natural History Museum. But this was Sharp's. When Sharp went out to India for 3 months to pack up Hume's collection, that was the only visit he ever paid to India.
Right, I think there's a question there, please.
Is Hume considered an important person in sort of contemporary Indian ornithology?
I think Hume's legacy is appreciated by knowledgeable Indian ornithologists. How widely he is known among the increasingly large general Indian birding public, because birding is, certainly in the last 10-15 years, really beginning to take off in India, and a wider interest, semi-scientific interest in birds. I'm not really sure, but certainly there is a publication now called Indian Birds, which is a sort of Indian bird watchers journal, scientific bird watching, and certainly there are a number of articles alluding to Hume are beginning to appear in that.
Right, I've had no questions from Ruslan recently. Has anyone got anything they want to ask Ruslan?
I just wanted to add something to do with the fact that about 5 things simultaneously came to my mind as you were talking.
Don't ask all at once.
No, I just short-circuited myself while I had all 5, that's all. I guess it was a sense that... sorry, I have to come back to that because it was about 5 things. I was just kind of all rushed out of my head.
Can I ask a question?
Yes?
I wanted to ask about if you know much about the expedition to the Andaman Nicobar Islands, because that is where Lord Mayo was assassinated,
yes.
And they were incredibly good friends, and he goes literally the year after Lord Mayo is assassinated, yes. And it's kind of way out. It's a really arduous journey, so I wondered if there was some sort of personal, because Lord Mayo is the one who got him the position as...
Of course, Lord Mayo was immensely important, and the assassination of Lord Mayo was an absolute disaster.
Quite a nutter, really.
Yes. I am not aware that there is a necessary link. What Hume was trying to do in his major expeditions was to visit areas which had been poorly recorded and where it would be difficult to just work with coadjutors, where he really needed to go himself because they were under-recorded or because he felt biogeographically they were very important. This was certainly true of the Sindh expedition. As far as I can see, this was true of his expedition to the Andamans and Nicobars. The Andamans and Nicobars, in fact, have a fascinating endemic fauna of birds. They're really interesting ornithologically. And they were fairly unknown. There was a little bit of information about them. And you can see the following expedition that Hume did was to the Laccadive Islands. Now again, a group of islands very poorly known. In fact, the Laccadive Islands are a lot less interesting than the Andamans and Nicobars, as Hume discovered when he went there. But I think the driving force was how important is it to go to this area to complete the picture of subcontinental birds.
That's kind of what I wanted to
That's
add.
right, not being
Yeah,
filmed.
I mean that's one of the things. I mean, as part of the
Yeah, if you give me more time between the question and the answer, that'll be great.
I'll try. As part of the his role in the revenues, agriculture, and whatever RAC, he was in charge of the in kind of mapping out places as well. That was part of it, and it has to be borne in mind. Mapping out places wasn't just a neutral activity; it was part and parcel of the activity of colonialism. I mean, in the book that he was part of the. Judy very kindly pointed me out the copy of the to the Yarkland expedition, which he wasn't part of, but which he wrote about. He collected. It seems like he gone and collected the data about the bird, but the context to that was really that they were the 3 people being sent, and with a whole group of Indian helpers. Who were taught to collect the skins and to go back, but they were primarily being sent to establish some sort of political relations with a territory to further trade. I mean, I think it's remarkable that these people were gathering information just because they were there. You know, there were people who had multiple interests, so they were there for many purposes, but. While they were there, they were doing many other things at the same time. They're not like just the sole expeditions you get now, just for scientific or just for.
Oh no, this was very much typical of the Victorian era. That in British military, often expeditions or administrative expeditions all over the globe, naturalists would be attached to the expeditions, and certainly with Yarkand, a naturalist whom Hume massively admired, Stolitzka, was attached to that expedition and unfortunately died on that expedition. And I think Hume then got involved with Henderson, I think it was, in writing up the ornithological results of that expedition. He massively admired this naturalist who died, and that must have played a major interest in that.
Bob, have you still got a question? You had one earlier.
I can't remember what it was.
Okay. Anything else? Right, well, it's all right for us to break for lunch early now?
Yes.
Okay. Right, lunch is available in the room back there. Afterwards, this room will be used for other purposes. So